morning, everybody. It's Eric from the Reptile Room, and today we're talking about basic care that you need to know for ball pythons. Now, co-hosting with me right here is Miss Aro. She is actually the first snake that I ever owned as a pet officially, and she is a good old classic or wild type or normal ball python. This is what you're going to find if you're out in West Africa and you are digging through the dirt looking for these guys. You're going to find ball pythons that look a heck of a lot like this. Now, these are one of the most diverse pet snakes in the industry, if not the most diverse for colors and patterns. There is a whole whack ton of morphs. There is a color and pattern of ball python for just about everybody out there. That said, there is something to appreciate from the good old classic wild type. Now, you don't see these morphs pop up in the wild all too often because they'd get spotted by predators and eaten right away. These are the ones that blend in. This is the phenotype, or the look, that has been selected for by their pressures or their environment. But there is all sorts of fun morphs that you can get, and we'll take a look at a few of those here. Now, these guys are probably the most popular pet snake. And there's good reason for that, one of them being their docile nature. They are a thick-bodied snake, so you can hand these off to a kid. Well, depends on the kid. Know the kid. And they are robust enough that they can take a little bit of a squeeze. You don't want to squeeze them too hard, but they're quite durable. As well as they're not very prone to biting. They can bite. Anything with a mouth can if you give it the right reasons to. But that's not their first move. Their first move is their namesake. They're going to ball up into a tight little ball and hide their head in the center to keep themselves nice and safe from predators. So you don't often have to worry about getting bit by these. That said, if getting bit by a snake is ever a deal breaker for having a pet snake, and you get a snake thinking it won't bite me, and then it bites you and you think, I don't want the snake anymore, just start off by not getting a snake at all. These guys live a long time. Ball pythons, you're looking at 20, 25, sometimes 30 years. With some outliers getting significantly older than that. At some point, there will be a miscommunication. At some point, you're going to get bit, and it's not going to be as bad as you might think. Let's take a look at the teeth that these guys are packing. Sorry, Aro. Let's see. I don't know if you can see them in the camera there, but it's mostly just gums. There we go. Thank you, good girl. They do have itty bitty little teeth that are super duper sharp and pointed for holding onto their prey and pulling it into their throat. But these teeth can't really cut you, they can't crush, they can't do a great deal of mechanical damage. So they're not going to do all that much to you. We'll talk about just a couple more features of these guys. These are pythons, so not all pythons get huge. This is an average size ball python here. But they are an egg-laying snake. They do have those little spurs of their vent. Those are vestiges of legs. There's little pelvic bones in behind there from their squamate ancestry. These are lizards after all at the end of the day. And on the front here, this is a commonality of all pythons with the exception of two species, that being the black-headed and Woma pythons. They have these little holes lining their face, and those are heat pits. Using those, they can pick up infrared light. Basically, they can see heat signatures, like Predator from Alien vs. Predator, or Predator 2. Really helps them narrow down their prey, helps them find good basking spots. Okay, all that fun stuff aside, let's dive into what these guys need to be happy and healthy pets in your home. So, when we're talking about poikilothermic or ectothermic or cold-blooded animals, there is one major consideration that you need to keep in mind, and that is that they can't heat themselves, and if they can't maintain the body temperature that they need to maintain, they can't digest their food. So if you take one of these guys and you throw them in a tank and you have no heating, you have no or too much heating in there, they're going to have problems. You're looking for a thermal gradient on one side of the enclosure. You're looking for about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or approximately 30 Celsius. On the other side of the enclosure, you want to drop down to about 75 Fahrenheit, maybe 20 degrees Celsius. That would be the equivalent there. You can do this using radiant heat panel, which is suspended from up top. You could have a heat mat controlled by a thermostat on the bottom. You could have overhead basking lights, or ceramic heat emitters or deep heat projectors if it gets too cold at night to help maintain those temperatures. You just want to make sure that you're not just throwing any old light on there and assuming that it's warm enough. It might be too warm, it might be too cold. You want to make sure you're really narrowing things down. You can do that using a point and click infrared temperature gun, works really good. You can get them for cheap at hardware stores. And if your source of heat is too overpowering or you're running a heat pad at all, you very much want to make sure you're running a thermostat on that so you're not going to burn your animal or your house down. Now, humidity is another very important factor to these animals. These mostly live underground, but they do live on top of the ground quite a bit too, but they're going to be finding little dens and caves to hunker down into where things are actually quite humid. Now, if your substrate, your bedding in there is just super duper wet, these guys will get scale rot or respiratory illness, so you want to make sure you're not going too overboard on that. But you are looking for a relative air humidity of between 60 and 80%. It can be a little higher during their shed cycle, closer to the 80 mark. You can use humidistats to measure this and sort of fall within the parameters that you need. If things are getting too dry, you can block off some of the ventilation of your cage, but make sure you're not just getting a whole bunch of stagnant air because that can cause illness and issues as well. You can increase that humidity by having a larger water dish. Having that water dish by your heat source will cause evaporation of water into the air by having the appropriate substrates, or by rocking a bioactive enclosure, which we'll talk about in a different video. These basically by default already have much higher humidity than your standard type of enclosure. Now, basic housing for these guys can be a little bit tricky. A lot of the things that are easily available within the reptile industry are not going to really meet their size requirements. These are a slightly larger snake. They're not huge, but they can hit 4 or 5 feet long. Not 45, that would be gigantic, but 4 to 5 feet long on average, sometimes a little smaller, sometimes a little smidgen bigger. Now, when they're a wee little baby, you don't want to slap them in a huge enclosure necessarily unless you've got things really crowded out. They're going to get quite nervous. They're not going to want to really eat. They're not going to find their water properly. So you do want to start them off sometimes a little bit smaller if they're not acclimating well to a large space. But ultimately, as an adult, you do want to have quite a bit of space for them. This behind me here is housing our Malagasy giant hognoses, but it would be an appropriate size for a ball python. This is 4 feet wide by 2 feet deep, and that is our recommended minimum for one adult animal. Now, having all that space is fantastic. You can have more space, and as long as you're setting it up properly and maintaining those temperatures, that is a-okay. Now, that enclosure can be set up a couple different ways. You could have a fish tank with top opening, a good secure lid with some lid clasps on it. You will struggle to maintain your temperature and humidity within that environment, but there are ways you can make it work. You can custom build something like these lovely wooden enclosures made by Cody back here. You could get a PVC enclosure. Those work quite well as well. Coming in from the top can work just fine. For the sake of convenience, having that nice front opening sliding or swinging door is a little bit more convenient, but either will do the trick. That's just a matter of convenience. There are a few basic things you need within the enclosure. Most notably, you're going to need a hide over on the cold side, sometimes with a little bit more humidity in it. You're going to need a place for them to hide on the hot side so that they can feel secure when they're warming up or when they're cooling down. You're going to need a water dish somewhere in between those places so that they can hydrate themselves, which you're going to keep clean on the daily. And you're going to need some sort of bedding. This can be as straightforward as newspaper if you're quarantining a new animal you've just brought into your home, or you could use a cocoa fiber to bring things a little bit more advanced, or if you're going bioactive, you're going to want a mix of a few different substrates to sort of hit that really naturalistic type of bedding in there. In general, you are going to want to rip everything apart, do a deep clean, full sterilization every other month or so. Fresh bedding, the whole 9 yards. But that's not the extent of your cleaning. That's just your deep cleans. You do still want to, as you're going on, every day you go in there, you make sure your water's clean. If you have live plants, you're watering those plants, but you're also removing any urates, feces, shed skins, any of that jazz. Maybe wipe down your walls and glass just to keep things nice and disinfected. But you do want to make sure you're not having a buildup of bacteria in there. You can't see bacteria, but they can see you, and they can do some real damage to, well, especially the pet that's living in them. So you do want to make sure you're keeping things relatively clean. Now, feeding these guys is a lot of fun. It's one of the many joys of owning snakes. When these were first in the hobby, they were notoriously difficult to get eating. It was just a matter of we were still figuring out what their husbandry requirements were, so they weren't settling in quite properly. Sorry, this Sulcata tortoise is making a hell of a noise over there. But we've got it pretty well narrowed in now. So Mr. Oro here has a diameter about yay big. I'd want to feed her a rat of a similar diameter to that. So she's eating medium rats. At her current adult size, she's eating about every 14 days. Too much more than that, she's going to start to get a little bit chubby, and too much less than that, and she's going to get a little bit thin. This is going to depend on the age of your animal. If you have a little baby ball python in its first year, you do want to be feeding it about every 5 days or so. Obviously not a medium rat, because it's just a little baby, but maybe a weaned to an adult mouse, maybe a fuzzy rat, a pup rat. I'm losing my words. But you just a size appropriate feeder item. Now, they will take live food, but this does come with inherent risks, and I don't necessarily recommend it. It's not really as thrilling as you might think, and a rat is very capable of defending itself. So if you throw a live rat in there and the ball python grabs it wrong or decides to not grab it right away, they could actually take some serious chunks out of these animals. We've had some rescues dropped off with some pretty wicked scarring, specifically from live feeding. So I do heavily recommend frozen thawed feeding, but there are a couple things you want to watch out for when you're doing that. You want to make sure your feeder item is good. If it's been sitting at room temperature for several days, obviously not good. Don't feed that. If it is still frozen in the center, because you're going to get these frozen feeders frozen, obviously, it's in the name, you want to make sure they're thoroughly thawed. If they're still frozen in the center but warm on the outside and you feed it to them, that frozen core is going to suck the heat out of the animal. Best case scenario at that point, they throw it up, which is a pretty serious ordeal for a snake. Worst case scenario, they go into shock and they die, which obviously is it's not good for them. So you do want to make sure you're thawing your feeder items out very thoroughly. You're looking for a temperature of about 100 Fahrenheit on the feeder itself, slightly warmer than our body temperature. You want to make it so that the heat pits on the snake are actually picking up that infrared light being emitted by that warm rodent. Now, you do want to make sure you're using some feeder tongs like this, probably a little longer, to separate the feeder from your hand, because your hand is a lovely big heat signature that's moving around. And if these guys are going to be seeing that heat signature attached to that rodent, they might get a little excited, shoot past that rodent, grab onto your hand. That can be a little bit painful because that's no longer a fear bite, that is a I'm hungry bite. And they'll hold on, they'll get a little squeezy. Pretty quickly they'll realize there's a weight class issue and they're going to let you go. But you don't want to rip them off if that does happen. You just want to be patient with it, maybe put a little bit of hand sanitizer, rubbing alcohol on their lip. They'll spit you out. You're going to be okay, and they're going to be okay, and you'll both carry on about your day. Now, after they do take their food, don't panic if they let it go, because at first they're killing it via constriction, which is causing such a rapid squeeze that there's basically a combination of heart failure and asphyxiation taking out their prey item. Even if it's frozen, they don't know that. They're going to do that, commit to that bit anyways. But then they're going to readjust. Ball pythons are not fast eaters. They can take, depending on the ball python, anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour to eat their food. So just want to give them their time and space to do so. And after they eat, maybe give them a solid 24 hours, maybe even a little bit longer before you pick them up and play with them a whole bunch. If you got to move them around, that's fine. But just to come out and interact, just give them some time. They've got a big food lump in there, and if you agitate that, they might throw it up. And like we were saying earlier, when you have no diaphragm and a third of your body is neck, throwing up is a very big deal. Throws off your gut bacteria, burns that throat all the way up. It's not a good time for you or for them. So with that, we've gone over all of our basics. We've gone over our temperature, our humidity, our feeding, our enclosure sizing, and our setup. Obviously, we were very basic with the setup with the 2 hides and a water dish. That's your bare minimum. You can add lots more than that, and in fact, I recommend it. These animals are smarter than they're given credit for, and if you give them enrichment, that will stimulate their brains, and you will get a happier, better adjusted animal as a result. Anyways, that is all. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and we will catch you in the next one. Say bye-bye, Oro. She doesn't talk much.